Welcome back to Histories Tech. Today we are looking at the North American X-15. This incredibly fast aircraft was a key component in the development of America's space program. And in fact, it was very close to being used as the first spaceship for the United States. But let's go ahead and look at the X-15. The X-15 was just a continuation of the X series of aircraft, similar in the X-1 and the X-2 and their development of supersonic flight. However, the X-15 was designed for hypersonic flight. This meant that the X-15 was designed to fly at Mach 5 or 3,800 miles per hour or faster. And as I stated earlier, they actually had thoughts of using this aircraft to take Americans into space. So even before the first X-15 had actually been tested, they had this idea of taking right here this SM-64 Navajo missile and strapping an X-15 to it in order to get a man into outer space. But when the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, they abandoned this in favor of Project Mercury. Instead of going straight into space, they began testing the aircraft, and they did a similar method as they did with like the earlier X-planes, where they launched them from a mothership. Whereas the Bell B-1 and the B-2s launched from B-29s and B-50s, the B-52 became the standard for launching the X-15. And they actually used two purposely modified B-52s, MB-52A and MB-52B, nicknamed the High and Mighty one and the Challenger. Later the Challenger became known as Balls 8. Flight testing for the X-15 began in 1959 with unpowered glide tests, moving on to the first powered flight test by the end of 1959, with a full-blown rocket test modified into the 1960s. Now, from 1959 to 1968, when the program ended, 199 test flights were launched, with 12 pilots flying those flights. Now, among those test pilots were Neil Armstrong, of course famous for the Apollo 11 mission, and Joe Engle, who would be one of the early commanders of the Space Shuttle program. One of the most important of these pioneers of test flights was Joe Walker, who took the X-15 to an altitude in excess of 100,000 kilometers, meaning he passed the barrier between the Earth and space, becoming the first human to go into space. The aircraft actually had a really successful record among all these pilots until Flight 191, when only minutes after its launch, the aircraft actually broke up in flight, killing its pilot, Michael J. Adams. After this, the second X-15 was actually rebuilt, having its hull lengthened by 2.4 feet, which gave it a pair of auxiliary fuel tanks, and adding a new heat-resistant ablative coating. It is this version of the aircraft that test pilot William P. Knight went up in October 1967 and took the aircraft to Mach 6.7, otherwise known as 4,500 miles per hour, setting a world speed record that has yet to be broken to this day. Knight would also be the very last test pilot for the program. When the 200th flight was supposed to happen on November 21st, 1968, it actually ended up canceled for multiple issues, and then they just decided to go ahead and cancel the program permanently afterwards. That aircraft was immediately put into storage and then was later donated to the Smithsonian. Now, if you would like to see any of these aircraft, the X-15-1 is actually at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The X-15A-2 is actually at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. Additionally, there are 3 mock-ups that can be found at Edwards Air Force Base, the Pima Air and Space Museum, and the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum. And even both B-52s still exist to this day. Pima Air and Space Museum has the MB-52A, known as the High and Mighty, and the Balls 8 MB-52B is located at Edwards Air Force Base. But there you have it, a look at the North American X-15, an aircraft that was the beginning of the American space program and almost became America's aircraft for traveling into space, but was replaced by the Mercury program, which is probably for the better. But that's it for Histories Tech, and I look forward to talking to you all the next time.